This is Bucky Stanton, and welcome to Technology Storytellers, brought to you by the Society for the History of Technology. Today I speak with Dr. Selika M. Ducksworth-Lawton, professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. In this episode, she outlines a captivating and important history of black self-defense in America, highlighting the Deacons for Defense and Justice, an armed self-defense group that protected black communities in the 1960s throughout the Jim Crow South. Selika further discusses the technology of the gun and debates about black self-armament today. You can find her historical work in the edited volume, Black Veterans, Politics, and Civil Rights in 20th Century America, Closing Ranks, and in her new forthcoming book, Honorable Men, the Deacons for Defense and Justice and Armed Self-Defense in Louisiana. Just to open us up, could you outline this history of American black self-armament? And then kind of dive in for this own research story in particular?
Well, very quickly,
please.
That this story really begins with the Civil War and the veterans who come out of that, because as they're coming out in 1865, 1866, the Black Codes are being written. And the Black Codes, the rewritten slave codes, are very carefully written to criminalize ordinary behavior. And every black code for every one of the former states of the Confederacy has a gun stripping provision, which bans guns. But they can't ban veterans from having guns, because that would conflict with federal law, and that conflicts with the federal requirements for militia. So the only people often in these communities who could have guns were the veterans. And once we have to look at guns as a tool of power. Guns are what people can use to prevent themselves from being terrorized. The reason why they're trying to strip guns from these communities is because they want to be able to terrorize them. And this combines with two Supreme Court cases that come out of the 1880s, Cruikshank and Slaughterhouse. Basically, Slaughterhouse says that your citizenship as a state in a state is different from your citizenship in the U.S. country. And that allows the state to violate your federal civil rights. Cruikshank says that the police and the state are not obligated to defend your civil rights. And it explicitly forbade the federal government from intervening to support your civil rights. So who does that leave to protect your civil rights? Veterans. And we're going to see armed self-defense really from 1870 to about 1930. People, it's not talked about in the K-12 system, because there's really a glorification of the idea that nonviolence is the only way. And that comes from this older idea of we don't want black people to have guns. Because when you look at who is policed for having guns versus who is not policed for having guns, Black rural people, Black people in urban America are policed for guns and often have legal Second Amendment rights violated by the police. Think of Philando Castile, while whites are not. And that is a part of the Cruikshank issue. And that part of Cruikshank still is with us today. And that's what we're seeing. When you saw 71 police officers go to surround the house of Derek Chauvin, who had killed George Floyd, right on video in front of us, with a cocky smirk on his face because he thought he was not going to be held accountable. When they do that and they leave the Lindale area, which is a Black queer Hmong, it's a Black and brown area. They leave it totally open to white supremacists coming from South St. Paul, coming from the Iowa side. Some of them came from Eau Claire, according to some of the Facebook posts from American Indian movement who was patrolling up there and who caught 3 of them. Although there's some people saying they came from the St. Croix area of Wisconsin. So these people are going in and the police are not there. Who winds up protecting that area? It's Unicorn Riot. It's the NAACP. Just like in 1877, 1880, if we look at 1921 in the Elaine Riot, who is trying to protect those areas? It's Black veterans. It's Black veterans with long guns. And they're portrayed as criminal because they are engaging in self-defense. So one of the problems for a Black veteran that you're going to see is this idea that self-defense in and of itself is criminal. What makes Black veterans very unique in this situation is they wear the U.S. uniform, they've been in combat, they deserve this heightened respect we give to veterans. And that makes it harder to impose that Jim Crow stereotype on them. But that also means that Black veterans in uniform are going to be unique targets for white supremacists, for lynching, and for regulation. So we can trace this all the way through Elaine riots. We get to the 1930s. We can see the veterans rise up around Isaac Woodward and the blinding of Isaac Woodward by a police officer who thought he wasn't moving fast enough, which leads to voter registration drives throughout the South. We see local veterans who will be emboldened by the Brown decision in North Carolina, who will also create armed self-defense leagues. Even Martin Luther King had guns in his house until Baynard Rustin converted him to full nonviolence.
Well, there's that famous MLK photo that is well known for various reasons.
Well, and there's several people who have written about that. Martin Luther King did not have guns himself, but other people did. And I'll quote Dr. Patrick Jones here in Selma of the North: scratch a nonviolent movement and you will find armed self-defense. So there's this history, and it runs through North Carolina, 1956, the Cambridge movement in Maryland, which was led by a woman, but was an armed self-defense movement. The difference between these movements and the Deacons organized militias. And they took the military experience that they had from World War II and Korea to create organized patrols, as opposed to these others, which were ad hoc, unorganized self-defense. This is organized armed self-defense. And it's so effective. It's one of, Huey Newton said the Deacons were the inspiration for the Black Panthers. So I wanted to talk about how veterans take that experience from being, especially in the U.S. Army, and they bring it into the civil rights movement. But I was also born and raised in Slidell, which is only 40 miles away from Bogalusa. My family, I was raised between Slidell and Orleans East. My cousin Rudy Lombard was one of the heads of Congress on Racial Equality during this time period. So it felt like I needed to frame this and talk about it the way we talk about it at home. Historians have tended to ignore this or to treat it as a sideshow or try to frame it within a radical working class ideal. And that's not really what these guys were. And women, because they were led by a woman, Gail Jenkins. Although Robert Hicks and A.Z. Young are the ones who get most of the credit. They are integrationists, and they saw themselves as special protectors of the people. But they also felt that African Americans shouldn't have to be beaten to claim equality. We shouldn't have to beg. We shouldn't have to be beaten. They're Du Bois's new Negroes. You know, with rights comes responsibilities, and the veterans felt they had a responsibility. And that includes the women who were veterans in World War II in Korea, who also came back to be a part of this. So when you look throughout the movement, it's studied with veterans at the local level and at the national level. I mean, Harold Washington, who was the first Black mayor of Chicago, World War II Korea veteran. Darrell Dinkins, a number of them. So to understand this, you have to understand those veterans come back with this idea that it makes no sense to fight for other people if we don't fight for ourselves, and that they have a special role in protecting the community, in organizing protection. So I think that's the shortest answer I can give you.
Oh, that's fine. That's fantastic. Were they influenced by kind of earlier histories in America of African Americans, like, you know, trying to take on a model race kind of characteristic in the World War I era to try and, like, you know, I know that Black soldiers fought in World War I and were like very celebrated by their populations back home for their victories in Europe, even though they were fighting unintegrated. And I wonder how those kind of fit in the greater timeline of this group coming back from, I believe Korea was the first integrated war, and how those politics kind of collided with the technology of the gun. So if you could kind of combine that with how the gun specifically as a technology, other than a technology of agency, or talk about that if you'd like, really like enabled this behavior and perhaps affected it, you know?
Well, you've got a couple of technological innovations here. The World War I veterans come back, and they're going to be the first veterans who are going to fight back at the white mobs who would periodically rampage through Black areas and destroy wealth. So the machine gun really becomes the game changer here, because before, these groups would always be overwhelmed. But the ability to take a machine gun and to cause some serious damage to a marauding white mob really means that you see this great drop-off of white mobs running through these areas between 1919 and 1939. And that's the machine gun. But that's also because the veterans knew how to do the machine gun. Mm-hmm. My favorite story is some research done by a colleague of mine talking about the Springfield, Ohio protests in Red Summer. And the veterans got themselves a Model T, put a guy on top of it with basically an M1 and drove people back. You know, so that's one of the reasons why Tulsa was so hard, why they brought out the airplanes, because you had Black veterans in there who knew how to shoot, and now they have access to a weapon that removes some of the numerical advantage. But to go back to your earlier question, the African American community has always seen soldiers as, and military people, as people to look up to. Partially because military people had equal pay at a time when the rest of us did not. And that had been fought for by those Civil War veterans. Partially it was because men fought in those wars to prove manhood. The soldier was the ultimate idea of a positive manhood, disciplined, competent, confident, but also holding the technology of power, the technology of protection. So the ability of the soldier to use the gun, and the perception of the gun as something that required skilled use. Not just anybody was going to be effective with it, is a very important part of this. So as we move through and we get to the Deacons, two particular guns are very important here. One is a 30 caliber carbine and one's a 50 caliber carbine. These are fairly good sized giant weapons. But on the other hand, for a civilian, On the other hand, double-barreled shotguns. And the way they talked about the weapons, the competence they talked about the weapons with, and their ability to use good judgment in deploying them. Whether we're talking about the Cassidy Park episode, where you have nearly 2,000 white people going after about 300 blacks and white allies. Whether we're talking about the standoff at Bogalusa High School over integration. The technology itself is as important as people knowing how to apply it. And here it's the application of the gun combined in a system where they are patrolling, they are doing forward intelligence work, but they're also working with lawyers to make sure that everything they do is legal, so they have to be let out of jail. And ultimately what they're doing is they're using the gun to force the police to protect the protesters, to create the space so that they can enforce that Civil Rights Act of 1964, enforce that Civil Rights Act of 1965. So the gun here becomes a critical tool. And the gun that is probably the most prevalent here, because they tried to standardize weapons, is your 20-gauge double-barreled shotgun, which was prevalent at that time. It was a fairly expensive gun for the period. So it showed that not just that the person had some wealth, but the person had the discipline to use it. If you've ever shot one of these, and I have, they kick like a mule. If you're going to get a second shot in, you have to be fairly strong. So they will mix that with some of the Army surplus M1s.
Which also has quite the kick.
It has quite the kick, but it's a lot cheaper. And many of them were bringing M1s and M14s home with them from the war. So now you have a set of cheaper guns that are reliable. The M16 is not reliable, but the M14 was pretty reliable, which they can use to be effective and to deter incursions by the Klan into their area, murder and mayhem. Because here, again, these weapons are power, but their access was the biggest issue. The access to these weapons was the biggest issue. White gun shops were not going to sell to black people. So for them to have these weapons, you either had to be a veteran, or actually Ed Sims takes a tour in May and June of 1965 to raise money to buy a whole lot of guns from Chicago gun shops, which he then brings right down the newly created I-55. So creating that access is important. Now the question becomes then, well, why didn't you have armed self-defense all over the South? And it's a combination of culture, veterans, and the percentage of blacks in the area. The higher percentage of blacks in the area, the harder it was to get a gun, the harder it was to keep a gun, and the more racial terror was used across those areas. So what I've done for my new book is that I've gone through the core field reports for the 3 collected states here, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. And I'm looking at how those field reporters are characterizing the counties in Louisiana, the parishes that they were thinking about working in. And then I correlated that with the demographic data for those counties. The majority of armed self-defense happened in an area with difficult terrain, which tended to benefit the technology here that benefits that weapon, with a black male population of under 40%, which means that they could get relative access to the weapon because whites did not see in those areas cutting off access to the weapon as necessary for them to maintain control. Once you hit over 60%, the level of terrorization in these places was such that Blacks would turn in Corps field workers to the sheriff if they could, because they were afraid of being killed for even being seen with them. So not having guns in these Black majority districts was one of the keys to white supremacy. And having guns, especially if you're in difficult terrain, it's very hard for agents of the state to be able to strip people of guns. You need to be able to have them. So this is where landscape intersects with technology in order to affect how people react to these kinds of issues.
I think that's a really fascinating story, and I love how you just put it about the intersection of the landscape and technology. And I also see, there's a policy landscape here that's constantly, it's almost like a firmament hanging over the entire structure of this socio-political history you've put together that can't be removed. There's certain constitutional limits that cannot be removed. There's certain ideas about the Army and veterans that cannot be removed. And there's this social arena happening underneath in your historical narrative here about how guns are able to accumulate power and push back against sources of power. And I'm wondering how you wrap this all together. What kind of concepts do you use in your work from, history of technology or public history or critical race studies or whatever it may be to really understand this historical process? What puts it together? Or alternatively, some guests like to talk about like a story or an example or something that really put it all together for them.
Well, the frame here is that African Americans have always had autonomy. And the missing narrative from the civil rights movement has been that autonomy, has been the idea of armed self-defense, has been the necessity of self-defense. And what I was doing was really pushing back against what several historians call the long Black Power movement, which tends to sort of fold armed self-defense into it as a sideshow and argues that this is proto-Black Power, but here we see real Black Power. Mm. And what I'm arguing is armed self-defense is an entirely separate entity. Black Power saw inner cities as occupied territories and really wanted to create landscapes of autonomy that would be closer to Native American reservations. That's why AIM worked so well with BPP, and you'll see them going back and forth. So, the Black Power movement also critiqued capitalism in a way that the Deacons did not. The Deacons self-consciously used the language of conservative white supremacy against white supremacists. Going so far as to seek out one of the FBI agents and telling them what they were up to. Now, they did not suffer from the illusion that the FBI agents would help them. What they were doing was manipulating the FBI agents so that they would manipulate the police for them. Telling them they were responsible, telling them they were only there to protect the Black community, they weren't going to overthrow the US, carefully separating themselves from the communist boogeyman of the time, but also saying, but we will defend ourselves. We do have this agency. We cannot wait for the federal government to protect us. And what's interesting here is they're doing this not just to protect Blacks, but also to protect the white lawyers and the white activists coming in, such as Miriam Feingold, who collected all of these papers for the University of Wisconsin Historical Society. So, this idea that the civil rights movement redeemed America, and by the selfless saintly sacrifice, and by allowing themselves to be beat, they redeemed the debt of white supremacy and then just forgave everybody and then equality happened. Nope. Somebody had to enforce this. And it's armed self-defense in rural areas and small town areas that got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 enforced, which parallels what you're seeing with the statues today. Civil rights activists asked very politely and nicely and nonviolently for the statues to be removed of, the white supremacy statues. The one that really sticks in my mind is the Liberty Monument in New Orleans, which used to reside at Canal and North Rampart, and had written on it, and in 1878, the nation allowed white supremacy to be restored. So it was very clear what that thing was about. And when I went to high school, we would have to watch, we'd have to take the bus right literally across from it. So you had a bunch of Black students from a segregated Black high school, McDonough 35, and the other one in the area, John Mack, who would cross over into the Esplanade, wipe our feet on the bottom of the monument, and then cross back over and get our bus. Or we'd sit on it to show our disdain. Mayor Mark Morial moved it, and then finally now Mayor Landrieu has taken it to be placed in the, I believe, Louisiana State Archives.
Wow.
But my question has always been, as we watch these monuments coming down, why did it take the violence to bring them down? And the reality is, Patrick Jones is right. Scratch a nonviolent movement, you will see armed self-defense. Armed self-defense is the stick that goes along with the carrot of nonviolence. People can work with nonviolent protesters, they can listen, and they can deal with it. But if they choose to ignore the nonviolent protesters, if they abuse them, then what comes behind will first be armed self-defense. What comes after armed self-defense is vigilantism. So it is a form of agency, and it is a form of agency that was deliberately suppressed in the history because the people who worked with Martin Luther King really wanted to highlight nonviolence, and the white historians especially wanted to highlight nonviolence because, to be honest, they didn't like armed self-defense. Now, while armed self-defense doesn't create the reaction that Black Power does, when I show my students pictures of the Deacons and pictures of Cambridge, they think, well, they just look like farmers just like us. They're carrying long guns. But they, those farm and feet hats and the overalls and things like that, for people like that, oh, well, they're just like us, they're just defending themselves. The Black Panthers with the leather and the berets and the very determined expressions on their faces remind my students more of an army, more of a militarized group. And that is one of the things that the Deacons did very well. Even though they were carrying guns, they were able to manipulate the media. And this is how the technology of the gun intersects with this technology of media we have. Then it was the television. Today it's the cell phone camera. How people see that image of the gun really impacts whether people will see the protester as reasonable or not reasonable. And when people like the Deacons carried their guns properly, they had them here, or they had them down, but it was pretty clear they were in control. But while wearing their work clothes, they appeared and gave the appearance of people who were merely using guns to protect themselves. And their rhetoric was Second Amendment all the way. It's ironic. There's an association today called the National Association of African American Gun Owners. And that's because Black people don't, most Black people who are gun owners don't think the NRA will do anything for you, especially after Philando Castile. that image was a powerful one. And it's especially powerful knowing that having a gun and openly, even though it's an open carry state, it still is. If white supremacists knew you had a gun, they would target you because of what's called the politics of protection. Black women were targeted to humiliate Black men and to show them they couldn't protect women, which fits into the politics of the time. Black veterans were targeted to make the community feel helpless and without protection. So for them to just be there and say, come in, just come on, that was powerful. That was hugely powerful. So they're manipulating the media images with the ways they used guns, with the ways they were photographed. And to be honest, when you look at the over 1,000 articles about the Deacons between February of 1965 and September of 1965, what knocks them off the front cover of Time magazine? Watts riots.
Wow.
So when you look at that, every editorial, every article focused in on the gun. Because this technology, I mean, the way the technology works is important here, but the symbolism of the technology as power, as agency, was important. And especially for the Deacons, who really saw, they felt that manhood was linked to agency. And the agency of being able to protect their homes, they felt, was especially one of the most powerful signifiers of manhood. So that meant that long gun and knowing how to use it effectively, but using it with discipline. Not just shooting people left, right, and so you don't brandish it, you don't do any of that kind of stuff. Being very disciplined with this technology that requires skill was a part of the manifestation of manhood. Not backing down, not being submissive. When you look at some of the videos at Louisiana State Archives, A.Z. Young and Robert Hicks were, they weren't aggressive, but they were not submissive. And they were not conciliatory. They were also very secular. This was not the, oh Lord, we're all Christians, oh Lord, protect us group. This was the, if you come around here again, I'm going to put a 30-06 couple of shells in your car.
Kind of pragmatism, if you will, right? Or like secular pragmatism, and that's so fascinating that you put that all together. That I think agency says it so well, because you just wove it together so well with not only the landscape but the gendered landscape of it. I've never thought of it that way, and the impact. And I'm now, like, as you're speaking, just my brain is flashing all these kind of gray and white, black and white photos or footage of the protests in that time period, and how it's putting in a new context, how you see a lot of the Black males either walking away from crowds, but, picking up their hat, not running away, standing in a line, being protective, and it's putting in a new context those things. And, we mentioned at the beginning of the interview kind of this present context, that there's, a huge resurgence of Black self-armament, and there's a huge resurgence in media acceptance and amplification of this message. And I see so much similar between what you're describing here in your historical case in that moment. I don't know about the specifics of the, veterans and the, how that plays a case, but there's a similar story to tell. And so to close out the interview, I just wanted to ask you, in the context of this conversation and your history, and if you go on your website and, look you up, your kind of politics-centered pedagogy, what's the takeaway for now about how we deal with continued racial justice, how white allies should react to, not just white allies, people of color allies, Black people and other marginalized communities? When a group wants to arm, there's usually a really big pushback. There's really a really big kind of liberal center conversation about it. But these consciousness-raising movements and this consciousness-raising history you have really asserts Black autonomy and rights in a really powerful way. So where do we move on from here?
One of the things that I think allies have to understand is that people of my descent have a complicated relationship with the gun, whether we're talking about a long arm or a small arm. And the small arms of today, which I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of semis. I'm a revolver person. You know, they're less reliable, but they're so light and they're cheap. They're cheap into comparison to the cost of what they would have been in the 1970s. For my community, that conflicted relationship is framed by the fact that we cannot trust the police in an urban environment. Let me be clear, in an urban environment. Where I am in Eau Claire, I work with the police a lot, and they're very professional. But Black people are less than 1% here. In communities where you see Black people hitting over 20%, you're more likely to see these militarized police forces. Calling the police in that community means the police are as likely to kill you as to kill the person threatening you. So you want to deal with it yourself. And for many of those people, that means having a gun in the house. But a gun is a double-edged sword, in part because of our allies. Our allies want to abandon us. They want to push us to ban guns because they live in communities in the suburbs where very few people are confronted with crime and very few people are confronted with guns. My husband's from South Central. And in LA, in 77th Precinct, they've had 3 consent decrees. One of them was because the police were acting as enforcers for the local drug dealers. You really wouldn't call the police then if somebody had broken into your house. So I think that especially some white liberals are going to have to make peace with the fact that equality does not mean that a marginalized group should act in a saintly manner or should have to engage in certain behaviors to redeem the soul of America. Mm. You know, that religious imagery that we get from Martin Luther King is really nice, but it's also really hard to do. We have to, and the irony is here that the presence of the gun, whether we're talking about Unicorn Riot, whether we're talking about the Huey P. Newton fan club, whether we're talking about the new Black Panthers, motivates change because they don't want you carrying the gun. So nonviolence is the carrot and the gun is the stick. And that is how we see change. I mean, that's the actual history. It's not the sanitized, feel good, we're going to march and do kumbaya. It's when the police are not there, and for the Black community, I mean, I don't know how much you know old rap, but 911 as a joke came out of real situations. When they're not there, you take care of yourself. And the gun, here, the long gun, whether we're talking about it being Lindale, or we're talking about being Bogalusa, Louisiana, or Carthage, Mississippi, was the equalizer that deterred the racialized bullying. And I'll leave you with this. When we're in the schoolyard and in middle school, we know that the only thing that stops a bully is to lay them out. Talking to them doesn't work. Reasoning with them doesn't work. You know, you can argue till you're blue in the face because bullies only care about power and they enjoy the power they get. Well, Ibram Kendi argues really that racist behavior comes from a wish for power. Racist thought follows racist behavior as a justification. It does not cause it. And the only way to deter that kind of racial bullying, because racism is racial bullying, is to meet power with power. Whether we're talking about a voting booth, whether we're talking about registering to vote, whether we're working with local assistants, or whether it's a 20 gauge shotgun in a gun closet. People who do not see me as equal or human understand a 30-06 shell. And unfortunately, that's the only deterrent to make them behave in certain circumstances. And that's what the Deacons understood. And that's what some people on the left are still arguing about.
Wow. And I mean, that's a historically complex answer. That's just what we're here for, because, you know, you contextualize it so well. The idea that right there in that example, if somebody doesn't see you as human, they're still scared of a gun. You can't change that. You can't change the fear. That cuts through all the, you know, epistemologies and ontologies of racism that are enacted every day, every box checked. That application of force or threat of is really what creates the new conditions of possibility. And I just want to thank you for coming on to Technology Storytellers and having this incredibly in-depth historical, but also present-focused discussion about a really, you know, sensitive issue that's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around. And as I said at the beginning, this topic has challenged my own, you know, liberal center views probably 5 years ago more than anything. And I just really appreciate you coming on and taking the time to really, you know, outline, move through, contextualize, and put in context this really complicated history.
Thank you for having me here. As I said before, it's an honor to be here, and I'm glad to do this and glad to represent SHOP for it.